I will try to keep these remarks fairly brief, but there are some things that I want to say about the repealed by way of set of introductory comments. So what's the significance of the Sexual Sterilization Repeal Act, or simply the repeal, as I'll refer to it from here on? And why does the 40th anniversary of the repeal warrant commemoration in the province of Alberta? Answering these questions involves considering both the content of the Sexual Sterilization Act and the broader eugenics movement that brought that act into existence. The repeal was introduced to the legislature of the province of Alberta by the Honourable David King on March the 23rd, 1972, and assented to there in the legislature on June 2nd. This act reads in full, Her Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta, enacts as follows. 1. The Sexual Sterilization Act is hereby repealed. 2. This act comes into force on the day upon which it is assented to. That's it. The Sexual Sterilization Act that's the subject of this repeal was originally passed in the Alberta legislature in March 1928, underwent important amendment in 1937 and again in 1942. These amendments, which primarily concern the issue of consent and the subsequent ease with which citizens in the province could be sterilised under the Act, are especially significant in terms of the government's own rationales for introducing the repeal in 1972. If you look at in Alberta Hansard, you'll see the debates and discussion turn largely on issues of consent. However, in these introductory comments, I'd like to concentrate on the original 1928 Act itself and on some facts about how the Act operated in bringing about the sterilisation of over 2,800 Albertans. The Sexual Sterilization Act of 1928 followed similar legislation introduced in jurisdictions in the United States, starting with the state of Indiana in 1907. The word eugenics does not typically feature in such legislation, and it does not appear in the Alberta legislation. While all such laws were clearly motivated by and form part of the eugenics movement in North America. At the foundation of eugenics is the idea that through the agency of governments and social organisations and institutions, and via individual decision, society can and should alter for the better what sorts of people there are in future generations. Sexual sterilisation acts to bring about such alteration through a form of what's called negative eugenics. That is, by restricting the reproductive capacities of citizens deemed to be less fit, and that's the phrase that was often used, in our society. Such people were thought likely to produce children who would also be less fit in future generations. Sexual sterilisation was achieved through surgical intervention on the reproductive systems of citizens deemed less fit. Common procedures included vasectomies on males and tubal ligations on females. But the surgeries actually performed, at least in Alberta, were often significantly more extensive and invasive of the bodily integrity of those sterilised than these common procedures can or need be. In Alberta, those recommended for such eugenic sterilisation were typically inmates or patients, to use the two terms that appear in the original Alberta legislation, at one or another of a small number of provincially run institutions. These included the Provincial Training School, now the Michener Centre, and Deer Home, co-located in Red Deer, and Alberta Hospital in Ponoka. The original legislation characterises the procreative powers of those people recommended for eugenic sterilisation in terms that should give pause, particularly when one recognises that many of those sterilised were, legally speaking, children. Their procreation was held to pose an, quote, attendant risk of multiplication of the evil by transmission of the disability to progeny, end quote. That's from the legislation. Sterilisation removed that attendant risk. Although not specified in the original legislation, those whose reproduction was thought to pose that risk were classified as either mentally defective or feeble-minded on the one hand, or psychotic on the other. These are terms articulated explicitly, however, only in the 1937 amendment to the Act, not in the original legislation. The Sexual Sterilization Act itself originally contained 8 clauses, and I'd like to conclude these introductory comments by reading the central clauses of that legislation, clauses 4 and 5. But first, some brief remarks about the remaining clauses. The final clauses, 6 through 8 of this Act, specify constraints or limitations relating to sexual sterilization. Clause 6 requires consent of the person recommended for sterilization or that of his or her relatives, a requirement that was loosened considerably in the amendments to the Act. Clause 7 exempts surgeons performing sterilizations under the direction of the Eugenics Board from civil actions, that is, lawsuits. And Clause 8 notes that the effect of the Act extends only as far as the authority of the province. The opening clauses, clauses 1 through 3, specify the short title of the Act, provide definitions of mental hospitals and minister, and introduce a rule for replacing board members of what was informally known as the Eugenics Board over time. Clause 3 also names the 4 original members of that board. The Eugenics Board played a central role in sexual sterilization in Alberta, in that unanimous approval of its members was required of every sexual sterilization conducted under the terms of the Act. The Eugenics Board was originally chaired by Dr. John McCachran, who was at that time Provost of the University of Alberta. To this day, he is the longest-standing Provost of the university, having held that position for over 30 years until his retirement in 1945. Provost McCachran, whose primary qualification was, like my own, in the discipline of philosophy, served as the chair of the Eugenics Board for most of its history. In fact, Provost McCachran served as the Eugenics Board chair from 1928 right through until 1965, less than 7 years before the repeal. His chairmanship of the Eugenics Board was coincident with his position as Provost of the University for almost 20 years, and it continued, almost as astonishingly in my view, for another 20 years beyond his retirement as Provost of the University of Alberta. What of those clauses that I've referred to as the central clauses to the Sexual Sterilization Act, clauses 4 and 5? They read in full, Clause 4. When it's proposed to discharge any inmate of a mental hospital, the medical superintendent or other officer in charge thereof may cause such inmate to be examined by or in the presence of the Board of Examiners. Clause 5. If upon such examination the Board is unanimously of the opinion that the patient might safely be discharged, if the danger of procreation with its attendant risk of multiplication of the evil by transmission of the disability to progeny were eliminated, the Board may direct in writing such surgical operation for sexual sterilization of the inmate as may be specified in the written direction, and shall appoint some competent surgeon to perform the operation. These clauses themselves may well seem as understated as the repeal, but like the repeal, much lies beyond the words that these clauses contain. In any case, I hope that these introductory remarks and this commemorative event as a whole will bring with them further reflection from Alberta's citizens and its political leaders, both on the broader history of eugenics in the province and on its contemporary resonances. Thank you.